I want to recognize two of my colleagues that are here tonight. I believe Councillor Dennison from Ward 4 is at the back. Jack, welcome. And also Councillor Paul Sharman is here right in the second row. Paul, welcome. And we also have some City of Burlington employees. We have our Director of Planning, Bruce Crucial-Nicky, that's with us, as well as our City Manager, Roman Martuk. And we have Lynn Robichaud and Fleur Storage Hogan from the Corporate Strategic Initiatives Department. So thank you very much. And thank you, everybody, for coming this evening. Just to give you an idea about the idea I came up with for this particular series is that certainly in my first term on council, I noticed that we often got down in the weeds and we discussed really some issues in a lot of depth that we didn't need to talk about. During the budget discussion that we had a couple of weeks ago, we actually spent an hour discussing how we're going to deal with a $1,000 item. I'm not kidding, that's very true. So the purpose of this series is to elevate the discussion in the community. We have a number of issues, both happening locally, provincially, nationally, and internationally, that will affect the world and will affect us being part of the world. We have concerns about climate change. We have concerns about peak oil, whether you want to call it that or not, it's a different story. But certainly 3 years ago, there was great concern about oil prices. Now oil prices are on the way back up again. And clearly, having enough oil is an issue in the world. Our population is aging at a significant rate. And everybody knows the whole boomer population born between about 1947 and 1963 is aging. What's the impact of that going to be 20 years from now? What's the impact of that going to be in our healthcare system? And this morning, while I was listening to the CBC briefly, I heard a debate between David Dodge, the former governor of the Bank of Canada, talking about the future costs of healthcare and how we're not dealing with it, and then a different viewpoint about how we can deal with it from somebody else from the University of Alberta. So the purpose of this series is to elevate the discussion in the community, to inspire people, to spark debate, to spark dialogue about this type of community we want to live in now and in the future. So I hope you enjoy this evening. I'm very, very pleased to introduce our first speaker of this particular series, and that's Christopher Hume. I had the pleasure of having dinner with Chris before this evening, and I think you'll enjoy him. He's got a great sense of humor, and he can be a little bit provocative, and I think that's a good thing because we do want to spark discussion in the community. But he is an architecture critic and urban issues columnist for the Toronto Star. In 2009, he won a National Newspaper Award, which is Canada's highest award in print journalism, for his columns about architecture and urban affairs. Since the 1980s, when he began working for the Star, he has received 5 National Newspaper Award nominations. And in 2009, the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada gave Hume its President's Award for Architectural Journalism. He has also received a Certificate of Appreciation from the Ontario Association of Architects. And his book, William James Toronto Views, won a Toronto Heritage Award in 2000, and in 2004 he received a Landscape Ontario Award. In 2009, he hosted and wrote a 1-hour special about Canadian cities for CBC TV's flagship series, The Nature of Things. He's been on radio and television as a commentator on city issues very frequently. He's known as a champion of cities and the arts, and he lives in downtown Burlington, but downtown Burlington, not yet. he lives in downtown Toronto, but he does have a Burlington connection he just might mention. So, Chris, on behalf of everybody here, welcome.
Hi, I'm very happy to be here, and I mean that very sincerely. I want to say right now that my intention here, I'm not here to insult everybody. I know there's a certain number of people who are expecting that, and I know a certain number of people will feel that, but that's not my intention. As the mayor said, my job is to be provocative. I mean, I work for a newspaper and I write a column, and our job is always to stir the pot. And of course, in some situations that's easier to do than others, and I'll let you guess how I feel about Burlington as the evening progresses. I'm not going to talk for hours and hours and hours, because perhaps it'd be better if we can have a question and answer period afterwards. But I do want to just explain that I'm not an expert in Burlington. I am not a Burlingtonian or a Burlingtonite or whatever a resident of this fine city is called, but my wife of 30 years is from Burlington. She was born and raised here. So I've been coming here to visit my parents-in-law for more than 3 decades. So that constitutes some kind of a relationship with this city. Whether I wanted it or not, I have it. And I can tell you that over the course of those years, I've seen a lot of changes in Burlington, and so I'm coming to you as somebody who knows, what I see is what I get, or is it what I get that's what I see? Either way, I'm just trying to let you know that I'm not just kind of driving through here. Although a couple of weekends ago, I did make my wife drive me here so I could spend the afternoon driving around Burlington, because there's no other way to get around here. And of course, that would be where I would start my remarks here tonight. And I think that my starting point is also that we are living in an age of, we're facing an enormous environmental crisis. And I know that a lot of people don't believe that. And I know that we tend to elect leaders who tell us that we don't have to believe that. I mean, there's a debate going on tonight. And I must say I'm thrilled that I'm only up against that, not against a hockey game. And certainly in Toronto, the city where I live, we have a mayor who I don't think is aware of the environment, let alone concerned about it. And I know your mayor's not like that, and I'm going to come back in the next few weeks and write a column about him and all his efforts to try to turn Burlington around. Of course, I'm sure many Burlingtonians don't think the city needs turning around, and perhaps it doesn't from their perspective. But from my perspective, which, as I say, is slightly different, although somewhat connected, I think Burlington has to learn some basic lessons. And you can ignore everything I'm going to say from now on, if you like. But I think that the mayor asked me here because somebody's told him about my columns, and therefore he wanted me to sort of sound that tone. And as I say, here we are in 2011, whether it's peak oil or not, or whether peak oil is going to happen in 5, 10, or 15 years, it really doesn't matter. The price of gasoline is up almost to $1.30. The point being that the Burlingtons of the world can no longer be sustained. And that's not just an opinion. I mean, the scientific community of the world would tell us that we have to change the way we live. And what do we have to change to? Well, we have to change to denser, more urban communities. And it means that the kind of suburban growth that has fueled Burlington and many other cities here in Southern Ontario for the last 50 years has to change. It's really that simple. And I don't frankly understand, maybe I shouldn't go there, but I think that, people all would agree that sprawl is a bad thing. But then the next part of that equation is one that we don't very often hear, which is that as bad as sprawl may be, there's only one thing worse, and that's density. And I can kind of understand why people feel that way, because I think that in the last 50 or 60 years, we've done enormous damage to our cities. But I also think that when we look back on the history of North America, especially in the post-war period, this will be a blip. And people will look back and they will say, what were those people thinking? And it was easy for us to say that because we were born and raised in an era of cheap oil, cheap land, and in a place like Ontario, unlike Europe, where land is very valuable, here land is considered cheap because there's so much of it. And so we just spread out further and further and further. And as long as the gas is cheap and as long as the cars are cheap and the highways are there, it works. But it can't work forever. And my argument would be, not only can it not work forever, and not only are the smart communities the ones that are going to understand that ahead of time and not find themselves left in a lurch 10, 15, 20 years from now, because frankly, if you were planning for disaster, you couldn't do a better job than Burlington has done. And I mean not planning to deal with disaster, but planning to create a disaster, because that's sincerely what's going to happen here. And so an entire change of a regime, and I'm not talking about the mayor, but a planning regime, a new way of doing things has to be introduced in Burlington, I believe. As I say, we can't go on and on forever, sprawling out further and further. And I think that the other side of this coin is that there are many benefits of density. There are many benefits of urbanity that we have learned to live without, that I think that people would be thrilled to rediscover. You know, let me show you some of my slides. I want to apologize, first of all. I'm not a photographer, and often when I have come here over these last 30 plus years, what we would do is my parents-in-law live south of Plains Road in a 1950s suburb, which of course looks kind of nice now because the trees are grown up, and my mother-in-law is a spectacular gardener. There's a large garden, large backyard, a ranch-style house, and you don't have to try too hard to understand the appeal that that lifestyle offered in the 1950s when they moved there. Excuse me, but in the 1950s, the world was a different place. In the 1950s, the next generation and the generation after and the one after that, we're all going to have a better quality of life. They were all going to have more, they were all going to have more, do more, own more, eat better, live longer, except that that's all over now. And I think for the first time in a long time, the future does not stretch out ahead of us as this ever more glorious place. In fact, I think the future has become a place that is profoundly threatening to many of us, because the very things we take for granted, the cheap oil, the cheap land, and an endless supply of both, are coming to the end. And we are very ill-equipped to deal with what's going to happen after that. So I see us living in a kind of a malaise right now. And I think the response has been twofold. The response, with the election of somebody like Mayor Goldring here, is let's do something about it. In Toronto, our response is let's stick our collective head in the sand and ignore it and pretend it's not going to happen. So I ask you, who's going to be further ahead in 4 years? It's not going to be Toronto. In any case, what I started off to say was that often when my wife and I and my kids would come here, we would pick up my parents-in-law and drive up to the north end of Burlington, where the Bruce Trail is, the Niagara Escarpment is, Mount Nemo, and all those places, and go for a walk, go for a hike. And it was always something that we all loved to do. And so here's a view from one of those places, like the ones that my wife and I would visit, and you can see off in the distance the skyline of Burlington. But the escarpment is one of the great features of Burlington. And here we were driving along King Road, and here's a hawk sitting on this fence. It's nice to see hawks. Nice to know that hawks can still live in the city. And then you've got these older suburbs towards the middle and north end of the city, with the boulevard down the middle of the street. There's a kind of a graciousness to this kind of life that one can understand. And now I know the chief planner is going to be marking down a little black note beside my name, a little black mark beside my name, because I took this picture. Here's the escarpment in the distance, and here's the subdivision, the housing subdivision in its shadow. And quite frankly, when I see this kind of thing, I ask myself, why is it that here we are, one of the great geographical features, one of the great attractions, if you want to call it that, of this part of the world. And what do? We build a suburb, a subdivision that could be anywhere in the world, that seems to make no special, seems to exhibit no special awareness of its location. And I think that one of the things that I've always felt about Burlington is that, with all due respect to the mayor and the chief planner and the councillors, that it's really, they are here for show, that the place is really run by the development industry, because everything looks the same. Everything feels the same. Everything is disconnected from everything else. And I think one of the first conditions to create an urban setting, to create a city, is one of connectedness. But of course, if the understanding is that the car is the basis of not just transportation, but of life, then that doesn't matter. But it does matter, and I think it matters not because we're facing this environmental catastrophe ahead, this environmental crisis, but because of the cost of living that way. What is that cost? I would say it's the cost of a civilized life. Now, I'm not suggesting that people in Burlington are barbarians by any means, don't get me wrong. But one of the sacrifices you make in a city when you don't have a lot of space and you don't have acres and acres and huge backyards and all that kind of stuff, is that you have access to various other amenities that can only be afforded when you have that critical mass of people and activity and money to make these things happen. Theaters, opera houses, subways, streetcars, all those kinds of things. Those are the things that connect people, those either physically or culturally. And I see that that's the kind of thing that's lacking altogether. But I think that we're coming out of a period of internalization. You know, Andres Duany, who is an American architect, who is the founder of the, what do they call themselves, the neo-traditional suburb people, the neo-urbanists they're called. These are the guys who build subdivisions but with white picket fences and front porches. It's not an answer, but I guess it looks a little bit better. And he shows a picture of a house that was built a few years ago somewhere in Texas, and it's about the size of this room. It's an enormous house. And in this house, there's all the regular stuff, the bedrooms and the living rooms and so on, but there's the kitchen, and then there's the breakfast nook, and then there's the home entertainment center, and then there's the home bistro. In other words, what's happened here is that all these things that people, all these things that people went out to find have all been internalized inside one house. So you don't go out to see a movie. You rent it and you watch it at home. You don't go out, you know, to the bistro. You have your own home bistro. And I guess, you know, there was at one time a lot of talk about cocooning. And one can understand the appeal of cocooning, especially, as I say, facing a future that is as bleak as the one that I've described. But perhaps even if the future is as bleak as I describe, it would behoove us and make us feel better to at least share the bleakness with our neighbors, and to have more in common with them than simply the fact that they live next door or that they are Burlingtonians. In fact, I don't know exactly what it means to be a Burlingtonian. I know what it means for my parents-in-law, and I know sort of what happens. Whoops. Excuse me. I know what happens kind of south of that part of Burlington. But there are a lot of other parts that, you know, as I say, it doesn't seem to be any connection. Let's see what the next slide is. This is sort of more or less what you see today in Burlington. And I think that my quarrel is not with the architecture, but it's with the placement. You know, you put these kinds of places on the edge of major streets, which are like this. And I guess the other point I want to make is that in Burlington, streets are a way to get from A to B. But you know, from Jane Jacobs on, we have been told, we have learned that streets are the destination themselves. They are the destinations. It's not just a way to get from A to B. And you know, when Bill Davis One time, the premier of this province killed the Spadina Expressway in the 1970s. He made a great speech, and he said, if we're building cities for cars, the Spadina Expressway is a good place to start. If we're building cities for people, it's a good place to stop. And I think that's exactly where Burlington is. Now, how do you change a culture that's been evolving at breakneck speed for 50 or 60 years? It's not easy. Quite frankly, I don't think that my generation is going to be the one to do it. But I think that my kids' generation is going to be the ones to do it. They are going to be the generation to do it because they understand, whereas we don't. They are not so set in their ways as we are. And I think that there are certain, I mean, I could go on forever and ever and ever, but, you know, I don't know if you've heard of Jan Gehl, Jan G-E-H-L. Jan Gehl is a Danish architect and planner who's famous because he basically has become a consultant, and he's worked in Australia, New York, cities around the world. And his whole idea is how to make cities livable. And he boiled it down to two things. And if you do these two things, you will, in the process, create a livable city. And the two things are to build and design our cities for pedestrians and to learn to share the roads, not just with pedestrians, but also with cyclists. Now, I know that Burlington has miles and miles of bicycle lanes. I was really impressed. They are empty as the buses that drive along right now. So I'm not kidding myself that everything is going to change overnight. And I don't think that's the point. I think that the kind of changes I'm talking about are the changes that this mayor will put into place and that some lucky politician down the road will inherit and say, see what a great city this is, because that's how long it's going to take to get us out of our cars. So here's a typical condition of Burlington. As I say, the street is a what should I say? I don't think one needs to say anything. It's a degraded suburban condition. You're not even meant to walk here. Of course there are no sidewalks because there's no need for sidewalks. Nobody is ever there, except if they're going to the gas station, of which there are about 2 or 3 in every corner, and the malls. And of course, you know, if everybody gets around by car, whatever they do, they have to have huge roads. They have to have enormous parking lots. I don't know, but the chief planner could tell you, if you added up all the land that is currently devoted to parking lots, which is the lowest form of land use there is, the lowest, it would add up to another Burlington, I'm sure. And if that Burlington were to be developed in a more dense, more connected, more urban form, it would transform this city. Now, it may be the case that nobody here is interested in that. Fair enough. I'm only here because I was asked to be here and because it's a great pleasure for me to be here. But let me carry on. See, now, this is the kind of thing that I see here, and you see it not just in Burlington, but many places. You know, and I think it's a response to backlotting. Backlotting turns streets into dead zones, into black holes. Whether they're suburban or urban, there's no worse way of building a road than having it backlotted. So the thing here is that this housing form has been reversed, so that the poor people who live here face onto a street which is more or less a highway, and not the kind of place that you really want to live, not the kind of place that you certainly want to face. It's not the kind of street where, you know, like my parents-in-law's street, where the kids go out and can play road hockey. You play road hockey here, you get squashed. It's very simple. So who's supposed to live here? People who have no interest in the city beyond their own front door. That's what this tells them. That's what this form tells them. Now, I'm sure that there are 1,000 reasons why a planning department can't do anything with it, and I won't go on and on about this, but it must be understood that the situation that Burlington finds itself in, like every other town, village, city in this province, is that Burlington is not the master of its own fate. We live in a country where there is no constitutional recognition of cities as a political level of government that exists, if you can believe it. The cities and towns and villages in Canada are creatures of the province. And you know, one of the province's main devices, however old it is, I think 130 years at this point, it's the Ontario Municipal Board, the OMB. The OMB has had the effect over the last century plus of infantilizing the planning process throughout the province, because every councillor knows, every mayor knows, and every planner knows that when all is said and done, it ends up at the OMB, and the OMB makes its decision according to its own logic. The OMB, of course, being a quasi-judicial body whose members are appointed. I bet not one of us in this room could name the chair of the OMB or even a single member of the OMB, but these are the people who have ultimate control over every planning decision in this province. And I would just point out that when the City of Toronto Act was passed, I think 3 or 4 years ago, it gave the city extra power. It could have taken some of the decisions that the OMB makes to make them, the city could have taken the powers to make those decisions itself. Has it? Of course not. Why? Because these are the hard decisions that people have to make. At the same time, we have a flourishing NIMBY movement going on throughout the province, and as I say, facing the future that we face, perhaps it's understandable that people are terrified of change. But it seems to me that we really have no choice. There is no choice. We have to change. But my argument B was that's not a bad thing. Change doesn't have to be bad. Change can be good. This is more of the same kind of thing that I'm talking about. You know, the only point of view from which this kind of development makes sense is the developer's point of view. Because it allows the developer to build huge amounts of housing for as little money as possible and maximize profits. That's just all very well, and of course we want developers to make profits. We want them to be here. But it has to be understood at the same time that whether you're building a gas station or whether you're building a subdivision for 1,000 people, everything represents an act of city building or community building or town building, whatever you want to call it. And of course we have these carefully crafted rules and regulations at the provincial level that basically forbid the local authorities from having a whole lot of input into the decision that gets made. I think that perhaps the best thing that the city can do is use its moral powers to say, yes, you have the right to do it, but we don't want it. But as I say, I mean, what can one say about this? Is that Burlington? Do you want it to be Burlington? Should it be Burlington? Maybe what happens is I see it happening around my house. Things fall apart and you get used to it, and after a while they become invisible. And you don't notice the fact that there's one step that you can't step on because you go through it, and it just becomes second nature. And I think that that's kind of a human response. We don't want to have to be confronted with the ugliness of what we've done every day of our lives, and so we just learn to live with it. A mall, a highway with a bit of leftover land. So where is life happening? Where do people gather? Well, this is Lakeshore, the north side of Lakeshore, just a bit west of Brant Street, the main street of Burlington. And there are actually a couple of outdoor cafes here that they're the only ones that I found. Now, it was a couple of weekends ago. It was still chilly. But the thing about Canadians is they're very hardy. And given half a chance, they love to sit outside. There's a little tiny place at King and Yonge, busy and exhaust-filled and noisy. And I see people clinging to these tables, and they're thrilled because they get to sit there and drink their lattes outdoors. There's a primal appeal, I think, of drinking one's coffee or eating one's food outside. And I think that, you know, not that the cafe is the be-all and the end-all, but it does provide a certain kind of measure about whether we just happen to live in a city or whether we inhabit our cities. And I was talking earlier on, and I'm going on and on here, but about how, you know, this internalization process. And I think that, you know, people live in cities like New York and Paris and London, where the property is very expensive, and they live in places, in apartments that are so small that, you know, by our standards, they're closets. And they happily pay for them, and they're thrilled to live there. There was a book written in the 80s called Slaves of Manhattan. I don't know if you remember it. In a way, it was sort of a very apt title. But I think that the point that I'm making is that you don't need to have all these things at home when you live in a city, because you've got 1,000 restaurants, you've got 1,000 cafes, you've got all the things you need, the parks, you know, the leisure, the opportunities for work, and all those things, you've got them all around. And you know, what is it that people like most to do? What they like most to do is look at other people. What interests us most, what interests people most is other people. You could drive around Burlington for a day and a half and not see another person who wasn't sitting behind the wheel of a car. And 99% of those cars have one person in them. You know, and so I was saying to the mayor over dinner, I went to Brantford last year to see the street of pre-Confederation buildings that that town happily and proudly and very stupidly decided to tear down so they could build some other monstrosity, which I'm sure is in the works as we speak. And there were two things that I saw that were really, really very interesting to me. And there were photographs in a book about historic Brantford. And one was a picture of the streetcar that ran up and down the main street. And the other was a picture of the train station in Brantford during the time of a royal visit in the 1920s. And the train station was littered with bicycles. And the streetcar, you know, was a way to get around. And so if I came to Burlington and said, what you guys need is more people riding bikes and a streetcar, you'd laugh at me and you'd say, what are you talking about? We don't have any history of that. That's not how we get around here. It was. And it was in Brantford, and it was in all these other places too. And they have winter, and they have hills, and they have distance, and they have all the same things that you have, but they made it work, I guess because they didn't have a choice. So at some point or other, we will be back, you know, where they were then. We will have no other choice. So that's why I'm saying to you that the smart thing to do, and Burlington is the third best city in this part of the world. I've been told by a number of people this evening already. I don't even know what that means. But I'm happy, because I'm sure Toronto is the third worst place, and I certainly feel that way on many occasions. But, you know, and I know that the planners and, with all due respect, the politicians would say to me, no way, it's never going to happen. But I think it should just happen. I think it should be something that nobody's thought of, nobody takes seriously, and that Burlington would become. I mean, I was in New Orleans a couple of weeks ago, where there's a streetcar that's about 120 years old, and these old things rattle along up and down St. Charles Street. They're fantastic. And it's not just the tourists who take them. And you know, it will come as news to many, but to live life without a car is the liberated life. If you have an alternative, if you can get around in other ways, it's liberation. It's like getting rid of that ball and chain. Being able to use all those parking lots for something better than empty cars. It's being able to narrow the streets so that everything isn't a highway, which is, you know, death or injury to any pedestrian who would dare cross. So I think that the potential is enormous, and I think the great irony will be that the planning regime on which suburbs are based, you know, where you live here and you work here and you go to school there and you shop here, all connected by highways, that built into that model, the now discredited model, is the fact that there's an enormous amount of leftover space, enormous amount of land that's left over. And that's where Burlington should focus its efforts, I think. So here's, excuse me, here are a few signs of life down on Lakeshore, just west of Brant Street. And then I go a few meters further, and all of a sudden, this is the north side of Lakeshore. within, spitting distance of that nice little outdoor, that nice little episode. That nice little episode lasts precisely 1 block. 1 block in all of Burlington. And I would suggest, respectfully, that it could be many more blocks. And that across the road on the south side of Lakeshore, just a little bit to the west, is this park that you all know of. Oh, I'm going the wrong way. Oh yeah, and here's a little bit further still. Lest anybody should have to drive another few blocks to go get to the gas station, there must be one downtown too, because there should be no part of the city that is not directly and accessible by cars day and night for the purposes of refueling, parking, and whatever else the car may need. There are few cities that I'm aware of where the abject enslavement to the car is as complete as it is here. Here we are, the site of the much disputed, pier, thank you. The one sign of life, the second sign of life, the waterfront park on the south side, which my wife and I visited and were very happy to see, and it was a great place to be. And then there's this hotel. This is the poorest excuse for a piece of architecture that I have seen in a long time. And I don't know why Burlingtonians don't rise up and go to Travelodge, whoever the local representative of Travelodge is, and say, we want something done with that building or we're going to tear it down. That would make the news. People agree with me. This is maybe one of the two, not maybe, this is one of the 2 or 3 most important sites, S-I-T-E, sites in Burlington, and this is what it looks like. And it's been this way for what, 30 years? Quite frankly, if Burlington and the developers who work here did nothing more than hire better architects, it would make a huge difference. And I don't know how you do that. Some cities have design review panels. I don't think Burlington does, but it would be a very good thing. It would be a very good thing. Here's the waterfront. But, just where you're starting to get the critical mass of activity here, you look across the road, and it's 1960s or 70s apartment buildings, towers and fields, and things like that. There's no backup to the activity that wants to happen. There's no depth. There's no place for it to happen. There is a restaurant I know that's part of the waterfront park. But once there's the lake, there's the park, there's the parking lot, and then there's a sidewalk, and then there's a street, and then it just dissolves from there. And I would suggest that there is the beginning of a critical mass happening at the waterfront, and that it doesn't need billions of dollars to sort of bring it to life, to enhance it, to make it happen on a grander scale, but just a few interventions here and there. And I would suggest that, maybe what Burlington needs to do is look into its zoning. And I know this is also a heresy, but I talked about all that leftover land. I mean, to think of ways of using some of that land. I mean, of bringing retail to the street. Why does the area along the sidewalk have to be a parking lot? I basically have to know that waterfront park is there in order to know it's there. If I were driving by, there are very few signals that I see, oh, there's a waterfront park worth visiting down here. I have to drive there, and I have to drive away from there. Same old story. And I would say that Burlington isn't going to be changed over the course of a year or two, but that in these small places where there are signs of life, that's where the intervention has to happen. That's where the measures need to take place. And I think it doesn't need to be big stuff. And I think up Brant Street too. Brant Street runs out of energy pretty quickly north of Lakeshore. And I don't know whether the rents are too high. I don't know what the situation is. But the downtown you know, I mean, even Brantford, which seems to be willfully self-destructive, has more of a downtown than Burlington has. And I guess, I don't know what the reasons are historically for that, but I would suggest, oh, and this is the Arts Center across the road. Again, I think it's probably oriented, there's probably a parking lot, I don't know, behind it, but it's just, I don't think it's ever been a virtue in Burlington for a building to have a street presence, because streets don't matter here. Streets, in fact, are to be ignored. So I would suggest that streetcars should run up and down Lakeshore, and then one of them turns north up Brant Street. I don't know how far north it goes. Let the mayor decide that. And that the planning regime either insist on a direct relationship between a building and the street, or allow a second layer of development to occur in between the sidewalk and the buildings that are more often than not set too far back from the street. And I would suggest that, you know, the Jan Gales thing, as I say, think in terms of pedestrians, think in terms of bike riders. And, you know, I think that planners, you know, the planning is a profession that goes back, I guess, to ancient Sumeria and the cities of Ur 10,000 years ago. But planning as a profession, like many, was really sort of formalized in the post-war period. And I think it's much sexier for planners to think in terms of the big picture, you know, what you see from 30,000 feet, or the mid-view, which is what you see on this block. But I think what really matters is what you see as a human being walking down the street, what you relate to. You know, Burlington, like Toronto, is obsessed with height. Everybody says, 20 stories, that's going to ruin everything. You know what? It's not going to ruin anything. The important thing is how the buildings meet the street. Does the building continue a streetscape? Does it provide retail opportunities? Is it interesting? Is it engaging? Or is it just, I mean, I would rather have a 20-story building on a street that did its work on the street than a 3-story building set back that has no relationship whatsoever to this city. And I think we have to get past this. It's the same thing everywhere else. I'm not singling out Burlingtonians for this. But the issue is not height. The issue is what's happening at the street level. And the fact that so little is happening at the street level, and that nobody's ever asked anything to happen at the street level. And I think that's what strikes me when I come to Burlington, is that there are parts of Burlington that are beautiful and parts that are absolutely beautiful, but it doesn't add up to anything. You know, the sum is not greater than the whole. That's W-H-O-L-E. More views, as I say, look at that picture there. Where's the waterfront? Well, you all know. But if you didn't, you wouldn't have a clue, except that there are more cars on the right-hand side of the road. And then, of course, the eternal hydro right-of-way, which seems to have left deep scars on Burlington. But I honestly believe that in the hands of a good landscape architect, or a number of good landscape architects, something could be done with these that would actually make them interesting. And I think that a lot of Burlington's problems are design problems. And that, how to put this nicely, that the quality of design, the quality of architecture, the quality of the landscape architecture is not of the highest. This is a nice building, for example, the building that we're in here tonight. It's a nice piece of architecture, but everything else about it is wrong. If with all due respect to McMaster, which I believe has a moral responsibility to have built in a smarter way than it did here, if they believe in what they're teaching. Because what we need to do in the 21st century, and I'm going to stop soon so that we can have some questions, but that what we need to do is we need to create density. We need to build housing and stores, and we need to build closer together. We need to stop wasting space. We need to stop building cities where we have to drive everywhere. You know, the old story about using a liter of gas to buy a liter of milk. Those days have to end, and I believe, from what I know about Burlington and having met your new mayor, that there's a will to do that. but it's not going to be easy, and the opposition won't come from Toronto or Hamilton. It's going to come from Burlington. It's going to come from within. So this is a big debate that's going to occur, if it isn't already, and I think it's going to be very interesting, and I'm going to pay attention to it. So thank you, and maybe now I've talked for 45 minutes, maybe somebody would like to ask a question, or should I leave quickly? And